to me.
Information, news, and entertainment on demand.
WSRadio.com.
Accomplishment Coaching is proud to present the following fine programming. Accomplishment Coaching, where coaches lead and leaders coach. AccomplishmentCoaching.com.
Welcome to WS Radio's Business Spotlight Show.
Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Wade Taylor, and today we're shining our spotlight on women in the C-suite and how often they go underappreciated, and they can solve that problem by reclaiming their own power. And somebody that's joining us today that knows a little bit about that is Dr. Alessandra Wall. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and a coach to fabulous women around San Diego and around the country. And you can find out more about her at lifeinfocussd.com. lifeinfocussd.com. So welcome to the microphones, Alessandra.
I'm excited to be here, Wade. Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, good stuff. Well, delighted to have you share your wisdom, because we need to have all hands on deck in this world. It's a competitive world across the world, as well as across a nation, as well as in your neighborhood. And if your company isn't leveraging all of the talent it has on hand, it is not going to be competitive, correct?
I completely agree with that.
All right.
Absolutely.
And so as we move into the discussion, one thing that we want to, just have recognized is that there are smart, hardworking, talented, ambitious, driven, resourceful, right? How many adjectives can I use to describe the power that's there? But these women are on the verge of being burnt out because they're feeling undervalued, they're feeling overworked, and not recognized for the value that they bring to the table. However, part and parcel of that problem is them owning their value and truly bringing it to the table. So help us understand a little bit about how women may not be serving themselves in expressing and making people aware of the value they are bringing.
So I think all the adjectives that you use to describe the women, certainly the women I see in my professional life and my personal sphere, are on point. And I know that a lot of us recognize that internally, maybe not all the time. But what I find with the women I work with is they really struggle to articulate all that value. And there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is how we're socialized. Part of it is the rules that we were taught growing up about not bragging, about being considerate of other people around us. But what that ends up translating into for many women and many professional women is they really don't have the words or don't have the confidence to clearly articulate what their value is. And that hurts not only them, but it hurts the teams they work with and the organizations they work for.
Okay. And so what are some of the things, it sounds like it may in part involve mindset, that they can look to recognize within themselves and embrace their true value? Because it really has to start inside, right?
Yes. As you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I look at a lot of things from that perspective of mindset. And what I think many of us recognize is a lot of the advice that's given to women today about how to show up and how to be successful in the workplace can be found in books right and left. It's nothing new. It's not that we don't know what we need to do. What really tends to stand in our way is cognitive, emotional roadblocks. And what I mean by that is fears and insecurities. There's some concerns about what will happen if we actually say what we need to say, if we don't play games, if we ask for the things we need to ask. And there is a mindset there that has to do with recognizing, first of all, that every single person in the world has insecurities. There's no way around that, right? But the way to deal with insecurities is not by negating them or pretending that they're not there. Rather, it really comes down to recognizing what our fears and insecurities are, understanding how they show up for us, how they hold us back, and then developing the courage and therefore eventually the confidence to act despite them still being present. Because that's the only way we get rid of them in the long term. It's acting despite the insecurities or the fears being present. And that is a mindset.
Right. And those are, the environmental circumstances, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, can't necessarily change the environment, right?
Exactly.
Can't necessarily change the world, but I can change myself. So once they recognize that, okay, I do have to overcome these externalities, I would assume that imposter syndrome is there to play a bit of a role.
Yeah, imposter syndrome is an interesting thing. It's a pop psychology term, and I do love it because I think it's fairly ubiquitous. It's that belief that that we got somewhere most of the time because we worked really hard to get there. But the belief is that we don't really belong where we are. That somehow we lucked our way into it. That we don't possess the skills that are necessary to operate or perform in that space. And what it leads up to eventually is a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. And oftentimes with women, I would say it translates into women feeling like they have to perform perfectly at all times and meet everybody's needs in order to be good enough, right? And that's part of the fear. That's part of the insecurities. What if I can't do something? Can I admit that I'm operating on a learning curve? Can I admit that I need help? Is it okay to picture myself as being really career driven and at the same time really want my evenings and my weekends for myself, right? And what happens when I can step into a space, own that all those things exist in conjunction, right? I talk with my clients and my patients about putting and between things instead of but, right? I am career driven and I really like, my personal time. I can be very competent and not be good at everything. So it's facing those things and saying, if I recognize that what I'm operating on, whether it's imposter syndrome or anything else, is a fiction, it's a story I tell myself, can I figure out how I would act if I didn't have that story? Can I articulate my value? Can I speak up? Can I show up the way I know I can, not the way I feel I should?
Okay, now that's powerful, and that's where I want us to stay here for a moment, because we've articulated there are external things that create limits to overcome, let's say, and there are psychological aspects, but there are actions that can be taken to compensate or overcome that, and that's what you do in your coaching practice. So continue giving us, once we recognize that, what are the things that we can start doing to push back against that and allow us to recognize and own our true value?
There are a number of things, but I'll focus on two of the big ones that I think are huge. So I'd start by saying, speak up. And again, speak up is one of those pieces of advice. I swear, if you pick up any book on female leadership or female success in the corporate world, somewhere in that book, somebody will be talking about speaking up, leaning in. It's all the same concept. But what speaking up really comes down to is understanding, again, that value piece that we talked about, that we started out in the beginning, understanding what your value is, understanding what you need, understanding what kind of boundaries you want to set around those needs, and having the courage to say what you mean, to actually mean what you say if you're going to open your mouth and speak up, to ask for the things you need. And recognizing in that space, if we have the fear and challenge and insecurity piece in place, that that's going to feel really uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the reason not to do it. So I talk a lot to the women I work with about speaking up. Part of it is because when I started working with women in the professional space, the women I was seeing were all the things you said earlier. They were talented, they were smart, they were driven, they were ambitious, which apparently is a really dirty word when you talk about a woman. They were hungry for more, and they were leaving their companies. Or they were staying in their companies, but they were miserable. And a huge part of the problem for many of these women was that they wouldn't speak up. Half the time, they didn't know what they needed to speak up about. They hadn't slowed down to think about these things. But even when they did understand what their value was, what their needs were, what kind of boundaries they wanted to set, what asks they wanted to make, there was this discomfort in showing up and very authentically and assertively, which is not the same thing as being bossy or aggressive or short. Just, it's about being confident, saying what you mean and meaning what you say. And what we found is when we could get women to do that, and I say we, me, and the women I'm working with, is that oftentimes people would stop and listen. Not always, but then I can speak up and ask to be heard if I'm not being heard. Oftentimes, people would work with them. What would lead to no change at all is holding all of that inside until you get so resentful, so burnt out, so upset that you don't even want to stay in your company or your industry anymore.
Yeah, you want your opinion to come out as well thought out, not as an explosion,
Exactly.
as a reaction. And, something, because this, again, holds true with everybody to a certain extent. People are people, right?
Yep.
But one thing I think might come into play is having the permission to have an opinion, to have a preference. And I see this in a range of people where, because they don't appreciate their self-value, they don't understand or accept that you're allowed to have an opinion. And even if everybody disagrees with you, who cares? You're allowed to have an opinion. Where some of these, we'll say men or, I don't know if we could assign a personality type. They just go into it going, of course I get to have an opinion. And there's every right that my opinion, and it's no more than opinion, should be the dominant thing. And they don't second guess themselves, right? They don't think twice about that. It's just inculcated in them. So can you talk, briefly as the time's racing by about how we can tie acknowledging our value to the permission to simply, you're allowed to have an opinion, and then that's what you can have the confidence to speak up about. Can you kind of tie that together better than I just did?
Well, I don't know. You did a pretty fantastic job of it. I like the idea of having the permission to have an opinion. I was having a session this morning with somebody, with a young woman, and this was one of the things we were talking about, right? The belief that being different, thinking differently, is bad. So part of having that opinion is recognizing that not that you're owed the permission to speak up, but that the one thing that is going to most influence the course of your life are not your circumstances. It's not whether there's bias or equality at work. It's the choices that you make. And speaking up is probably the easiest way in which you can affect change in your world, by asking for the things that you need. And if you ask and you don't receive, you have a data point. I think there's permission in that, and saying well, I have permission to speak up, to say something. And maybe what I say will be rejected. And maybe what I'll say will be proved incorrect. But as women, we struggle with that. We have filters, we have roadblocks that prevent us from doing this thing. I mean, one of the ones I talked about earlier was the desire to be everything for everyone at all times. If we hold that belief internally, it impedes speaking up, because we tell ourselves, I can't ask for what I need if it goes against what other people want or need from me. There's the belief that we need to be good girls, right? That starts, my mother used to, before I left home, would say, Alessandra, remember, behave like a lady, every single time. It was so embarrassing. But it's drilled into us. Behaving like a lady means being polite and being kind and being helpful. So if I have that barrier, I'm not giving myself permission to speak up, because speaking up might upset somebody else,
right?
Might position me ahead of someone else, right?
And let me just throw in also that being a lady, there's an underlying subservience that's expected.
There's some of it. I wrote about it recently, right? I have two sons, so I get to watch little girls operate in other people's families, but there it's very much expected that they're going to help with their younger siblings, that they're going to set the tables, that they're going to do things. And I try to change this with my boys, but even my boys, they don't get up automatically. They have to be asked. There's certain things that are bred into us, and they're not necessarily bad. The mistake is to take those circumstances and say, I am limited because. The fix is to sit there and go, I have a choice. And my choice comes from, first and foremost, acknowledging what my worth and value is. Then from understanding that just because I acknowledge or know it, that doesn't make it any easier to say it. So I have to understand what kind of filters, what roadblocks are going to keep me from speaking up. And then when I see those things show up, I have to be willing to recognize that they're just figments of my imagination, right? So what happens if I act the way I want to be in the way I am rather than the way I feel I should be? And I start in polite ways, in small and big ways, sharing my value, asking for the things I need. If somebody's listening, for the women who are listening, one of the first things I'll tell people is it's as simple when we get back to all working together, right? As when everybody's trying to decide where to go grab lunch and people are talking about Chinese, saying, oh, I'd rather eat Italian. That's it. You've just spoken up. Start there. It's as simple as starting there, because that will translate eventually into saying, I love this idea, but the timeline you have for it is not feasible for my team. And that started with saying, I wanted Italian instead of Chinese, or I wanted Japanese instead of Italian,
Right. The small steps that establish a pattern mindset. And I would like you to also speak a little bit about permission to fail, because you might, this could be considered the A student syndrome, where the student's so used to getting A's that they start fearing getting anything other than an A, because, like you're saying, well, I have to be perfect every time. But
right.
Now that inhibits risk-taking, because I'm not going to try anything unless I'm assured success. And as you're in that office, as you're in that boardroom, as ideas are being thrown away, some of your ideas are thrown around, some of your ideas are going to be bad. But that's okay.
Right.
That's perfectly fine. So can you talk a little bit about accepting failure?
The big mindset shift, to go back to mindset, that we need in order to accept failure is to make the distinction between failing at something and being a failure ourselves.
Okay.
And that's one of the big problems, right? That happens with our experience of failing. It's like we can't even use the word anymore. People are so sensitive around it, but all of us fail at many things, often. But what failing is, again, I like to talk about data points. It's a data point. I try something, it doesn't work in this way. I said something, it fell flat. Maybe I tried to speak up and it came across as aggressive because I was really, really nervous, right? And I learned something from that failure. And that allows me to build a better approach for the next time I'm going to try something. It's very different to fail something and to be a failure. To be a failure requires an accumulation of personal failures that then dominate my experience as a human being. So if I fail at nearly everything I try, then I'm probably a failure. And if that's the case, you should figure out why that's happening and do something about it.
Yeah. And remember, all of us, when we were kids, all infants, all toddlers are complete failures. And
yes.
Right? They fail at walking, and then they try it again. Then they fail at walking, and then they try it again. And they don't let the constant failure stop them from eventually succeeding, because, like you said, failure is what gives us data points, gives us the ability to adjust, right? We've got about 6 minutes left. Just the time races by, and what you're saying is so fascinating. But I want us to kind of continue, because, you've talked to us about recognize the externalities, recognize and don't let that inhibit you from recognizing your own value, own your value, and now be confident to speak your value, be willing to challenge the status quo. Even if you lose some of the battles, you can still win the war. But this is now playing out in an environment, right? We need to be doing this in the boardroom, at networking meetings. Can you talk to us about how we express this newfound ownership of our value and desire to make that value known? Because until we make it known, it will not be recognized and therefore rewarded, right?
Yes, in these 5 minutes now, I think I'm going to try to express that on two fronts. So one, how do you express it? Well, one exercise that I do with a lot of my coaching clients is have them identify what they're really good at and look at it from a very factual standpoint. So that when you sit and you start sharing with people what it is you do, what you're good at, what you love, and you're articulating your value, you realize you're not bragging because what you're talking about is fact-based. Right? It's not blowing smoke. It's not trying to build up a persona that isn't true. It is fact-based. And so we talk about confidence. Women want to feel more confident. You talked about social networking. People will say, oh, I feel so uncomfortable going and talking to people. I don't know. And I mean, shouldn't I just work harder? There's a certain point in your career where success is no longer a meritocracy, where everybody is excelling. And when you get to that point in your career, what is going to determine whether or not you go all the way up to the C-suite or you build the business you want to build or you thrive is who you know and what they know about you. It's a trust-based system because humans are social animals. So it is very important to be able to walk into a space and present yourself honestly and authentically. That means being clear about who you are, what you need, and what your value is. It also means having the courtesy of expressing those things and not leaving it up to other people to guess it, to figure it out, to pull it from you. And maybe thinking about it in terms of courtesy will make it easier for some women to do. But the idea in networking or in building social capital, which is the way I like to think about it, is that by building relationships and genuine connections with people, we give them an opportunity to understand who we are. That understanding builds trust. The trust will result in them thinking about us or considering us when opportunities happen. And we do the same thing. We're more than happy to recommend a skilled worker or somebody we know to a friend because we trust them, because we've seen the quality and the value that they bring to the table. And that friend is much more likely to want to hire that person because their trust and our relationship with them makes it so that they trust our recommendations. That's what social networking and social capital does for us in the business space. So it is worth it to practice this speaking up, to practice showing up as yourself, and to do it not just in the privacy of your office, but to do it in your social interaction and network at large, so that you build connections, you build trust, and you open the doors to opportunities, but you also get to know other people so that you can create opportunities for them.
Yeah, I've learned that more and more the longer I go about living and being in business. It really isn't a meritocracy. You know, you have to be competent, but it really is about the social relationships. And I've discovered whoever owns the relationship controls the business.
Yes. And a lot of times people will talk about whether it's fair or not, and I'll move them away from that idea. It doesn't matter if it's fair or not. We are social animals. Actually, what it is very evolutionarily normal for human beings.
Right. I love that. And I don't want to take away from what you're talking about. We've got just a couple of minutes. But I heard somebody talking, and they said, when I was in high school, I succeeded because I was smarter than everybody else. But then I went to college, and everybody was as smart as me, so I had to work harder than everybody else. But then I went to Wall Street, and everybody there was as smart as me and as hardworking as me, and I found the only way I could succeed was now I had to be the most authentically me possible.
It's actually that's a beautiful line, right? Because it also talks about how it is an evolution of skill, right? It is just another skill, just like learning to study hard, just like learning to apply yourself, learning to present yourself, and to groom these relationships, and get to know people and manage the social aspect of it is just another life skill.
So we've got about a minute left. Unfortunately, the time does race by. What I'd like to spend that, and let me just throw in, we're going to talk about COVID, but let me simply say, take all this as you will in this new world of COVID. But I'd like you to spend the final minute talking about how people can engage with you, because we've hopefully opened up their awareness, but now they need to follow up with action, and I know that's a terrific thing you can facilitate.
There are two best ways of getting in touch with me. One, I would say, is via email. And I can share that email if you'd like me to.
Please.
It's Alessandra, that's ALESSANDRA, at lifeinfocussd, like San Diego.com. So that's one great way. And the other way is actually on LinkedIn. That's where all my conversations, that's where all my social networking is happening during COVID. There's still an opportunity to have tons of conversations with interesting people and to build those networks and to be there for others. So LinkedIn, my handle there is at Dr. Alessandra Wall, is another great place to connect and to learn more.
Alrighty, and I'm assuming at lifeinfocussd.com also has resources that they could use. It
does, yes. There are resources. The site has both pieces of what I do, the psychology piece, the coaching piece, actually all three, the speaking piece. So there are resources, information, and tons of ways of getting in touch with me through that site as well.
Perfect. So lifeinfocussd.com, Dr. Alessandra Wall. Great information. Take it to heart. We'll be back next time with more great information here on the Business Spotlight Show, powered by WSRadio.com, the worldwide leader